If y'all saw the lesson for lesson 7, it's very short, and it covers a lot of the same geography. I was reading through this and looking at it. Just for some background, I've been pretty much everywhere we're going to cover on these maps, except for Egypt. Wish I had some pictures I could show you guys, but it's neat to kind of connect these two and to the Bible. And like Phil's been saying, that we're trying to connect the stories of the Bible to these lands, and it gives us a clearer picture of how everything interacts. Like it says at the beginning of the lesson here, everything is interconnected, and you see how the children of Israel and later the early church, how they're influenced, how they were influenced by different lands, different countries. And we see a purpose for that. Their particular location, the geography. We notice the trade routes. What are the 3 through Palestine again? The trade routes.
Of the coastal highway and Shore and King's Highway. That's
right. And when we get to this bigger map, we'll see how that plays a role in the spreading of the gospel later on for us. Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. So you might want to read those. Verses 1 and 2.
Every person is to be subjection of the government authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those which exist and established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves.
All right, I bring this verse in particular up because as we go through the story of the Bible, you see God raising up nations for his purposes. Sometimes that's to judge the northern tribes. Sometimes that's to judge Judah. Sometimes that's to institute certain power structures so that the gospel will be spread later on for that. Can somebody bring up Exodus? So we're going to talk about Egypt, and later on some of the more detailed lessons we'll go through the Judges period, Syria, Babylon, Chaldeans, the Medes, and the Persians. So can somebody pull up Exodus 9, verse 16?
For this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all of the earth.
All right, this is what God is telling Moses to go tell Pharaoh, and is saying, hey, I'm raising you up to show myself in all the earth. And we hear about this later on as Rahab the harlot proclaims, oh yeah, we heard about what happened in Egypt, and we're terrified of you guys coming in here. How about Judges chapter 2, verses 16 through 18? Judges 2, 16 through 18.
Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the land of those who plundered them. What verses?
Through 18.
That's good enough.
Through verse 18.
To verse 18. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the land of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they poured after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judges. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them.
Yeah, we're very familiar with the Judges cycle, and we're going to hit on some of the peoples, like the Philistines and some of the other peoples around the area that afflict these Israelites as well. All right, so the Assyrians, they come from the Mesopotamia area, which we'll see on the map. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 26. 1 Chronicles 5 and 26.
So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, Eleazar, king of Assyria, and he took them into exile, namely the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them to Halah, Harbor, Hara, and the river Gozan to this day.
All right, so this is part of the children of Israel getting carried away by the Assyrians, and then the Assyrians end up kind of going away, and then the Chaldeans, kind of based in Babylon, they're raised up. 1 Chronicles 9 and 1. I'll read that one. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel, and Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. And it continued on with that same thing, 2 Chronicles 33 and 11. So that's all the children of Israel end up getting carried into captivity. 2 Chronicles 33 and 11, I'll get that one too. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the kings of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks and bound with him and the chains of bronze, and brought him to Babylon. So you kind of see both the ones we're talking about there, Assyrians and the Babylonians. And then somebody want to read Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 4 through 5. Jeremiah 20, 4 through 5. Okay.
For thus says the Lord, behold, I will make you a terror to yourself and all your friends, and they shall fall by the sword of their enemies while you look on. And I will give all of Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. And he shall carry them captive into Babylon, and shall strike them down with the sword.
All right, thanks. And then we'll get to the Medes and the Persians. Daniel chapter 5, 24 through 28. And Daniel's kind of an interesting case because he covers basically three different ruling peoples in there. Daniel 5, 24 through 28.
Daniel 5:24.
5:24 through 28, yep.
Then from his presence the hand was sent, and his writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, many, many tekel and parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
All right, so who's doing all this?
God,
God is. Like he said, he's got his purposes to judge the Israelites. We see this in the Old Testament section before we move into the New Testament. So we've got, what the lesson introduce is Mesopotamia, Meso meaning in the middle, and Potamia between the waters. So it's between the waters. This refers to which two rivers we're talking about here? The Tigris and Euphrates. It's kind of what many people refer to as the seat of civilization. That's where we think the Garden of Eden was. Of course, it was destroyed in the flood. But this is where kind of the Bible story picks up. And because of these rivers, and we've talked about some of the desert lands, but what's on each side of these rivers when you look at your maps? Let's go east and west. What's east of the rivers and what's west? Right.
Yeah.
And there's a huge mountain range over there. Yeah, so the Zagros Mountains, very tall, about 9,000 feet tall. In the wintertime, there's snow-capped mountains, really beautiful over there. And that's kind of like a natural barrier, natural wall. That's where the Medes and Persians kind of come from. Persians have a deep history. They're very proud of their history in Iran. Still refer to themselves as Persians. So that kind of blocks people from going east in any kind of masses. And then towards the west of that, the Tigris and Euphrates, where does that run into?
what's Iraq today, and then on into the Arabian Desert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then north of that, we have the mountains of Ararat. Anything special about the mountains of Ararat? Right. And it's a Mount Ararat. There's a traditional spot. It's two peaks. You know how legend carries on. But that's where they said Noah stepped out of the ark, was between those. Really tall mountains, about 17,500 feet. Some of those top 20,000. You see those from the air, and you're amazed at how big those things are over there in eastern Turkey. That creates a natural barrier to the north, and then to the south, we talked about the Arabian Desert, and then to the west, there's some desert land over there as well. The lesson talks about some lava lands that are kind of east of Canaan, east of Palestine. Actually got a rock, landed on a dry lake bed over in that area, and got a lava rock from that area. So that you can see what looks like change in terrain is actually the blackness from the lava fields over there. So imagine trying to walk across that with a caravan. You can't do it. So that's why people stick to Mesopotamia, these two rivers. They kind of live right in between them or close to them. Another name for that is Aram Naharaim, the Aram of the two rivers. You know, Aram is a descendant of Noah. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So it comes from Shem, I think, and it would have mentions in there in the lesson. It's only important because the Israelites are kind of like distant cousins to these people, and they kind of grow up to become great nations in there. So as we move through Mesopotamia, what's some points in there on your map that we heard mentioned in this story? But Nineveh, or yeah, that's kind of important. That shows up in Jonah and throughout the text there. See if you like Monty Python movies, like Philip, it shows up in the search for the Holy Grail. The capital of Assyria is Nineveh. We mentioned Haran, and one of those where Assyria was. How about Abraham? Comes from where? Ur of the Chaldees, and talk about the Chaldeans in there. So it is. It sure is. It's close to the Persian Gulf over there. If you notice that on your maps, this is the far east side of this map too, over there. So this is the only fresh water there is around. Persian Gulf is salt water. The Great Sea, the Sea Mediterranean, is all salt water. And the lesson also talks about the Red Sea, and it's kind of got two branches, the Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. Over there, it's all salt water. So these people are surrounded by salt water and desert. So they stick to the rivers, which is why you see these civilizations coming up around the rivers. Lesson also talks about early writing, cuneiform. We actually have quite a bit of that. I've got a biblical archaeology book at home, and it shows some of the early tablets of that. And anybody seen cuneiform before? Pictures of it or anything like that? Basically, it's in this nice mud, and they use like these wedges to make different shapes, and that eventually gets translated into syllables, which gets translated into Aramaic, which we see Jesus speaking later on in the Bible. So that language kind of carried through out there. Stayed for a while. All right, the Arabian Desert. Where does that show up on this map too? Right. So in the Bible, the lesson talks about it kind of being a mysterious area. We don't see much interaction with people from the Arabian Desert. We do see Solomon interacting with a particular queen. You guys know who that is? Queen of Sheba, yes. Doing some research on this a couple years back, Sheba could either be modern-day Yemen, or one of the maps puts it near Bahrain. So it's somewhere in the Arabian Desert. We think it's close to Oman and Yemen to this current day. But again, not much mention of that area in there. Solomon, when it also when he's reigning, talks about him sending out these ships that come out, I think, like every 3 years. And there's Ophir, and they get monkeys and gold and all that kind of stuff from around this area. So it's toward the south. So not very many mentions in the Old Testament for that. Then what's this, the move over to Egypt? So where does Egypt show up here on the map? Yeah, southwest. And ancient Egypt is limited to what major river system? Yes. The West mentions the Nile is about 4,100 miles long, longest river in the world is what it says. Starts out as the Blue Nile, White Nile, pretty far south in Africa, and flows north. Not many north-flowing rivers in the world. One interesting thing about this river is the flow takes you north, and the wind can take you south. So if you want to sail south, you can sail south in the river. It's a broad river, not very deep. And if you want to go north, you just float north on there. You go east or west of the river, there's nothing there. It is this dry, talc, salty sand. So they rely on the floods for the Nile to come through. It says it's 16 times the volume of the normal river, the low point in the river, when it floods. And you get the silt, very rich. The Egyptians also developed their writing. Anybody know what that's called? Hieroglyphics. So unlike cuneiform, which changed into Aramaic, the hieroglyphics, they never really changed. So anybody know how we figured out how to translate the hieroglyphics? There's this spire, and it's called the Rosetta Stone, and it had different languages on there. So that's the only reason we could ever find out how to translate the hieroglyphics. So it has, I think, Greek hieroglyphics, and then I don't know if there's some other language on the other side, but it correlates the two. So that's how we know how to speak that. Great history of Egypt. The lesson mentions, hey, there's no evidence of the Israelites in there. Anybody have a guess why the Israelites may not be mentioned anywhere in the history or archaeology?
Probably mad at them for plundering.
You think so. History is written by the victors, and the Egyptians practiced revisionist history. They would always make their king very strong. And you see this throughout all the ancient cultures. The Babylonians or the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Persians, they really puff their leaders up, and anything that bad happened, they won't write about it at all. So that's what we haven't found much. Although they are searching, finding more. There's a couple pictures, and I'll bring that book sometime, but it has pictures of these foreigners. Hebrew means foreigner or stranger, that are prisoners in Egypt, and it has them like bound with handcuffs behind their back and stuff like that, laying flat. Anyway, it's pretty neat about Egypt. So they're finding more and more stuff every day in there. So the river's long. There's a lot of trade that happens up in there. They start irrigating. The Egyptians, super smart. So what do we teach our kids now in school? Used to be reading, writing, arithmetic. But their arithmetic, they were teaching them advanced geometry, Euclidean geometry. Everybody knew it. They find it in archaeology, these houses, and then they're like, oh, wow, these guys are super smart. Makes sense because you have the pyramids that are built, kind of mirrors Orion's belt, the perfectly north-south orientation, perfectly square. So these people were really smart. They didn't have much to do other than figure things out. So, anybody know how much older the pyramids are than Abraham? The lesson mentions about 1,000 years older than Abraham. So there's been some, I would say, myth or tradition that they used the Israelite slaves to help produce some of the pyramids, and the timeline doesn't match up with that at all. There's a big gap between those two, and they can date some of the wood fragments that are left over there, some of the other treasures they have that are organic in material, and there's a gap between when the Israelites were there and when the pyramids were built. Although there were cities built by the Israelites, it mentions those in Exodus. All right, talks about the wilderness of Sinai. Very dry area, very mountainous area, not much there. When you look in Galatians, so that there's this, let's say there's dispute about where the real Mount Sinai is. Where does Paul in Galatians say Mount Sinai is? He says it's in Arabia. And it's just say it as a fact, Mount Sinai, which is in Arabia, in there. Does anybody know when Mount Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula was named Mount Sinai, and by whom? Okay, it was named, I think, by Catherine. There was a queen of England, and she said, okay, that's Mount Sinai, and they had made a little chapel at the top. But when you look at the biblical account, and you look at some of the geography, where the Israelites, where it talks about, hey, they were surrounded by mountains and right up against the Red Sea, and you look at, there's like one little thin strip of subsurface land, the subsurface of the water, land, like a little strip where people could walk across. So when you think about God putting the Red Sea as a wall on both sides of them, there's one area that crosses straight in the Gulf of Aqaba, which is considered part of the Red Sea, that crosses over close to Midian, where Moses' father-in-law is from. And it makes you think, okay, they were over in this area wandering towards Arabia on the eastern shore of the Red Sea, where the Muslims to this day have a site. They have it fenced off. You can't even climb the mountain, which says, oh yeah, Paul says that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. And the Muslims have this fenced off area that they honor Moses as a prophet as well. That says is Mount Sinai, and that is also where Midian is, where Moses' father-in-law is. We see him join the Israelites after they leave Egypt. So say there's some debate about where Mount Sinai is, whether the English named it or where Paul says it is in Arabia, over there on the eastern shore of the Red Sea. So wilderness of Sinai, very, very dry area. There's a couple of oases over there. It's considered part of Egypt. There's a little sliver out at modern day between Egypt on this side, Israel on this side, and then Jordan on this side. And Jordan joins up with the Gulf of Aqaba over there, where there's a Roman colony. We'll get into the Romans here soon. I already talked about the Gulf of Suez, which is about 200 miles long. The Gulf of Aqaba, which is about 100 miles long. Suez Canal did not exist in that day, so. Any trade routes along the eastern shore of the Red Sea? Yeah, there's one right along the eastern shore. Think about the Queen of Sheba, Queen of the South. There's a big frankincense and myrrh trade. We see that showing up in the story of Jesus and around his nativity, traveling along the eastern side. That's also where Mecca, Medina is. So big, highly traveled area to get stuff from the south up towards the north through more trade routes in there. And that's how these people made money. Think about markups. So you have a bunch of middlemen in between. You get the raw goods, and it needs to be transported to other places because people need it for the spices, frankincense, myrrh, gold, salt, whatever, and you basically pay a tax as you go on the way. So I heard one geopolitical analyst say, yeah, it's about 1,000% change between where it started and where it ended up because people needed these things. Right. Anybody heard the term Fertile Crescent before? Yeah. In this text and in this lesson, they consider it going from the Persian Gulf along the Tigris and Euphrates all the way down to Egypt. Although we know between Egypt, the River Nile, and the rest of the Fertile Crescent, there's this big dry space with the wilderness of Sinai. And then we have the mountains, like we talked about, and the high desert to the east of Palestine. So not exactly fertile along the coast. I know a couple have been to Israel. It's kind of like a dry coast. You do have some mountains that have some vegetation in there, especially like the Lebanon. You have the Great Sea and the winds coming up there. You have the sea breeze. It'll bring moisture up. You get these great cedars of Lebanon, these tall trees, but not a lot of rain around there. So it kind of dries out, and then you get to Egypt again where it's fertile again. But for this text, they refer to the Fertile Crescent as including Egypt. although there's some dispute about that with geographers now. All right, so Old Testament lands, very small area. And it only covers really Mesopotamia and Egypt, and there's a couple others that come into there. It's a river life until you get modern transportation and can have water purification and carry stuff like that with you. So any questions on the Old Testament geography? Yes, sir.
Not really questions, comment, kind of. When I look at the maps, and when we look at these maps, it helps make it real. You know, you put the picture in your head of where this is at and why this is that way. Like, and it's easier to relate to when we look at the map, because you asked the question, was there waterway along the Red Sea? Well, we're not really much different than them, because we build roads besides all the water too. You know, they build ports and travel ways beside the sea just like we do. And to help put it in, sometimes I'm like, where is that really? When you think about the Arabian Desert, it sounds like it's just wasteland, there'd be nothing there. Well, that's not the case today. That surely changed. But now Saudi Arabia is just full of oil wells like crazy. So it's interesting how you can look at the map and try to place the stories in your head on where they happened, and then think about what it is today.
Yeah, it's interesting how that translates through time, throughout the Bible, kind of Middle Ages, modern era, and modern satellites and archaeology. People that can go out and explore is absolutely amazing, because we know because of the flood, there's this massive store of water underneath the Sahara Desert. Sahara Desert, when you dig down deep enough, there's actually megafauna and flora, big plants and animals they have found underneath there, huge reservoirs of water. So there's just water shortage in Africa. Actually, there's a giant lake underneath the desert out there. Same thing with Arabia, Saudi Arabia out there. They're actually talking about building cities underneath the surface of the soil, or the sand out there, but because it's cooler and there's water underneath it, and oil. Modern day Iraq, where Mesopotamia is, tons of oil there, discovered in the 30s by the Brits. They thought it was worthless. It was just this terrible thing they had to deal with that kind of polluted the water. Was carved up into 3 sections to keep everybody at war with each other, because people have a great memory. Go through the Bible, especially the Old Testament, you see people constantly fighting, right? Well, they carry that through all their generations. To this day, even, they still have bad blood between different peoples because of the history that goes on through there. And because of that, modern-day Iraq was carved out to make them weak intentionally, so that the Brits could rule over them very easily. So if you have people fighting each other, it's easy to have somebody else step in with their own power and move in. All right, anything else on the Old Testament land? All right, same map, different political context, a little bit bigger geography for the New Testament land. As we travel, and each of these, this is a big overview. We're going to go into very fine detail on the history of each period throughout the Bible. So as we go throughout, we mentioned Daniel, and Daniel prophesies or reads the dreams of some of these leaders. And it talks about, do you remember the statue from Daniel? It had the golden head and the silver and the bronze and clay. That's the transition through some of these kingdoms throughout here. After the Medians and Persians, Babylon being the highest ones, you have Medians and Persians, then you have kind of the Greeks coming through. The lesson also talks about this guy. Who's this big guy that kind of established the Greek kingdom, and it went all the way to the Indus River Valley over towards India? Big conqueror. So Alexander the Great. Very large kingdom that kind of establishes the Greek kingdom, which the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, kind of a common person's Greek. So that influence started after the fall of the Median Persians. Then when his big giant kingdom kind of gets divided up, his 4 generals under him divide that up. Daniel talks about this as well. And then you have the fractioning off again of Egypt and Persia and a couple of these other countries over there. which then you have the beginning of the Roman Empire. That starts to spread where we get to the New Testament, where the Jews, or where Jesus enters the scene, is under the rule of the Roman Empire. Now, where do the Romans rule for the most part? There's a big giant sea. Yeah, almost the entire coastal area of the Mediterranean Sea. We've already talked about the northern Africa, Sahara Desert. You have people living along the coast, and not much south of that until you get to sub-Saharan Africa, meaning below the Saharan Desert over there. So it's pretty easy for them to rule the coast. They have ships, because we know Paul traveled on ships when he's doing his missionary journey, and when he's carried to Rome to carry out his appeal to Caesar. So you have the influence of the Greeks, and then Rome comes along. And how far east is Rome able to go before they aren't able to exert their rule and influence and power anymore? Almost all the way, yes. It's not, well, I was to say it's not on this map. They made it to, which is labeled on this map here as Media, the Parthians. So they weren't able to fully conquer the Parthians, which is modern-day Iran. And like we mentioned before, part of that reason is because of those Zagros Mountains. The Zagros Mountains carry all the way up to the mountains of Ararat and towards the Black Sea, like you see there on their map. It is very, very difficult to get over those things, rough terrain over there. And then once you get over towards where the Parthians or the Persians or the Medians lived, it is all mountains all throughout there too. So there's no flat area like the Arabian Desert or along the Nile in Egypt or in like the Jordan Valley in Palestine or along the Mediterranean coast. So they're not able to conquer over there. But they do have all along the Mediterranean. And they kind of co-opt other cultures and control them, and they use basically merchant ships and the Navy and all that to maintain the area. Okay, we didn't talk about this much in the Old Testament. The Hittites are mentioned as being in there. They're enemies of the Israelites. They come from what is labeled on this map as Asia Minor, and there's the Hylas River. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's in modern-day Turkey, and that's just to the west of Mount Ararat, south of the Black Sea, north of Cyprus. But you have Asia Minor. We know that's mentioned quite a bit in the New Testament. Cyprus, there's a travel companion of Paul who is from Cyprus, who's also a donor to the early church. He's a son of encouragement. Barnabas. So Barnabas is from Cyprus. And you'll see him and Mark split off and go back to Cyprus for a while. When remember that contention between Paul and Barnabas got so sharp that they divided? I think Barnabas takes Mark with him, and then they go back to Cyprus for a while because Barnabas is from Cyprus.
I think it's when Paul took Silas.
That's right. So Paul is from Tarsus, which is actually on the south shore of Asia Minor. And there's some mountains right up there. There's a town called Adana there currently, which is right next to Incirlik, which is a major air base that the United States uses throughout there. Anyway, beautiful area. If you like to grow figs or olive trees or persimmons or any kind of the nice fruits, they have it all right there. Beautiful climate. They get rain from the cold fronts. We get cold fronts here and we get rain. The same thing over there. It's nice weather for growing different fruiting trees.
You fly there in the military or
In the military. All over there. From Turkey down through Lebanon and Israel and Jordan and Arabian Desert and all that over there. So you have Asia Minor ruled by the Romans, Crete ruled by the Romans, Cyprus. And then you move west, and you see Ephesus there on the kind of the western shore of Asia Minor. There's several churches over that way. Most of these are coastal because, again, this Asia Minor, except along the coast, not much water. The water that is there, it can be salty from the great, think about when the flood happens, it covers all the mountains. And then all that water settles into these valleys, and you have evaporation. And what's left over when you evaporate a bunch of water in a salty area?
The Dead Sea.
Yeah, Dead Sea, and then even in our own country, think about Las Vegas. There's lithium and a bunch of different type of salts out there. So you dig down and you get some salty water, or the lakes there are super salty, you can't drink them. So a lot of coastal areas. You also have Laodicea, which is I think really close to Ephesus. We mentioned Laodicea in one of our recent lessons over there. And Colossae over there. So the Romans built up aqueducts, and they helped transport water. And between Ephesus and Colossae, there's aqueducts, and then you have got Laodicea in the middle. So you had hot water from the springs in, I think, Ephesus, and the cold water springs in Colossae, and they were trying to bring the aqueducts in between. So when it's in Revelation where it talks about, hey, the letter to the church at Laodicea, you're neither hot nor cold. That is bringing in, hey, cold springs from Colossae, warm springs from Ephesus. You're neither hot nor cold. So by the time the water makes it to there through the aqueducts, you can't bathe with it, and it's not really good to drink, not cold water anymore. So I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. So that's kind of where that imagery comes in through there. Paul talks with the elders of Ephesus. You see the ships coming in there, and then all the Greek islands over there in the Aegean Sea. Remember the dream that Paul had? Where he says, hey, they tried to go on, I forget, where Paul was trying to go somewhere, and he had a dream, and it was prevented from going to a certain area. And then he says, I see the man in Macedonian clothing. So they dressed in a particular way. And then they took that as their sign to go up to Macedonia, which is kind of the southern shore of, Macedonia's there on your map. So you got Philippi there. They end up going to Philippi, Roman colony. So the Romans controlled that area as well. And then you see them going down to Athens and Corinth. And Paul has to leave Corinth to go back to Athens because they don't like him there very much either. Also, what's not on the map here is Thessalonica. You see Philippi is kind of the east of Philippi, back towards Asia Minor. And that's where Paul was pursued by a lot of zealous Jews to try to kill him as well. So talk about the letter to the Thessalonians. Most of the epistles that Paul writes is on that tiny little area right over here. And then to the west of that, you see the Adriatic Sea and then Italy, and then Paul makes his way to Rome. Mileta, you see on the map just south of Sicily, that's where he was shipwrecked, got bit by the snake. And then he hopes to go to Spain, which is not on this map, to tie the Old Testament and New Testament together. Where was Jonah trying to go? Where did God tell Jonah to go? And Nineveh. So he was supposed to go north and east to the capital of Assyria. And where was his ship trying to go? So it said he joined a ship, was it Tarshish? There's some dispute about where Tarshish is because of the changing of that name throughout history. But I think we'll see in our map, southern Spain. So that's the furthest we see in the Old Testament is southern Spain. Paul talks about going to Spain. He hopes to go to Spain. So southern coast, it's all Mediterranean. So outside the New Testament, we don't go anywhere outside of the Mediterranean area. So that's as far west as we go is Spain. And as far east, really, we can see is the Mesopotamia on there. And as far as south, we talk about the Queen of South, Queen of Sheba, and not much north. We talked about the trade routes. So the trade routes cut through the center of Palestine. Now, if you're trying to spread a religion to the whole world, to the whole known world at this time, where would you want to place the seat, the center of that message initially to start out?
where you could reach the coast or the inlands, either one,
right?
right where Palestine is.
A highly traveled area, right? So day of Pentecost, you know that it's like 11, 12, 13 languages that are mentioned. They all came back to Palestine. And then they stayed for a while. Church is established. But this is like the ideal geography to spread a message to the entire world. That's why you see the influence of the Israelites around in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, particularly important. You see the Romans being raised up, and because of the Roman rule and the roads and the shipping and their interactions with Palestine, with the Israelites at this time, you have this massive spreading. You think about disease spreading throughout the body, how it multiplies and goes through all out. Well, this is much better than a disease. This is the Word of God. This is salvation. Perfect place for this to happen. Trade routes coming all throughout there, and the shipping and all that. So you kind of see why God uses the different, the kingdoms to kind of shape and mold the people for his purposes throughout this time frame. I forgot to mention Crete. So Paul's journey to Rome, he stops in Crete. There's a couple harbors on the south side over there. And other than that, we don't see much mention of Crete. But the early church, I've been on Crete and Cyprus, and I talked about where Tarsus, where Paul's from. So in the base there, they actually have a map of all of the churches, and it talks about the Apostle Paul in the base visitor center there. If you want to go leave base, they make you look at that over there. And then Crete, there's a similar type of deal with that. They show the churches along there and where Paul went. And then after the text of the Bible, we have stories of John and Mary being in the Greek islands and Crete, and then going out to some other islands over there as well. Not in the scriptures, not in the Bible, but that's hearsay as far as we know for that. Any questions or any comments on this little small area for the Old Testament and New Testament lands?
So a small area, distance-wise, what are we looking at, 1,000 miles?
From, let's say, from the Persian Gulf over towards Italy, 2,500 miles, that's about it. That's pretty much the entire story of the Bible, is that little tiny area, and not much north and south. I mean, maybe 500 miles north and south, and that's it. But here we are, a 12 and a half, 13-hour plane flight away from Israel, and we're worshiping God together. And all this started in this land over here, so it spread. Anything else? All right. A couple minutes, we'll start our worship. Thanks for your help and attention.